Tower Talks. UT President Jay Hartzell delivered the annual State of the University address today, a closer look at his speech. Vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance admits to spreading false information. Plus, a deep dive into defining and identifying misinformation. All of this coming up on Tower Talks. Good evening and welcome to Tower Talks, the show where we take a closer look at the stories affecting Texans, Austinites, and students right here at UT Austin. I'm Medha Sarin, and tonight we have an expert panel lined up for you to talk about misinformation. But before we get into that, a lot is going on around the world and in politics. UT President Jay Hartzell took to the Hogg Memorial Auditorium stage to deliver the 5th State of the University address this afternoon. During the nearly hour-long speech, he boasted UT's various achievements and initiatives, including in student life and research. Hartzell announced that 2025 would be the year of energy, in addition to a new position for Professor Millie Price to coordinate and identify gaps in the vast amount of programs UT offers its students.
But what I've asked Melanie to do is really help just coordinate what's here. What are the gaps we have, what are the things we can fill in, but also how can we make this more accessible for our students as they want to find their way through all of our.
Hartzell also touched on projects on campus to increase housing, initiatives like the West Campus Ambassadors that address safety, and programs to support students' health and well-being. Hartzell also mentioned the growing demand of the university and briefly referenced the recent change to UT's automatic admission policy, which was decreased from the top 5% to the top 6% of Texas high school graduates. He looked to the future continuously, referencing his goals to attract elite talent to the university, and briefly discussed the vision to become the top impact research university in the world. For more on the State of the University address, head to our website at tstv.news. At the presidential debate last Tuesday, former President Donald Trump claimed that Haitian immigrants were eating people's pets in Springfield, Ohio. The baseless claim has been traced back to a decades-long hate campaign by neo-Nazis. White supremacist groups have used the claim of immigrants eating pets to demonize groups legally immigrating to the United States. In the past few years, Haitians have legally immigrated to Ohio due to the open job market. Over the summer, a post on Reddit showed a photo of a man carrying a dead goose. Right-wing media outlets and neo-Nazi groups picked this up to prove Haitian immigrants were eating animals in the city. However, a deeper dive showed the photo was not from Springfield, but in Columbus, Ohio, and the original poster did not know the person's ethnicity. Recently, a Facebook group in Springfield became overrun with rumors of pets going missing and baseless claims that Haitian immigrants were eating them. NewsGuard reached out to the original poster, who admitted she did not have any first-hand knowledge and that the missing pet story was misstated, as it was not her neighbor, but a friend of a friend. The baseless rumors has brought the town of Springfield into the national spotlight. Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance made false statements regarding Haitian migrants in an interview on CNN's State of the Union with Dana Bash Sunday. The Ohio senator repeated the claim that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating the pets of citizens, despite no evidence to substantiate such a claim. When challenged by Bash, Vance insisted that he was only repeating what he's been told by his constituents. Despite this, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine told ABC News there is no evidence of such events occurring. In his interview with Bash, Vance insisted that his claims were only made as a result of his constituents being ignored by mainstream media, and that creating stories to drive attention was something he was willing to do. Since former President Donald Trump first pushed the narrative in last Tuesday's presidential debate, the city of Springfield has received over 30 bomb threats towards local schools, according to the New York Times. Some of these threats specifically target Haitian Americans. In response, Ohio has deployed state troopers to Springfield city schools Tuesday to ensure student safety. When we come back, we'll speak to our panelists about their perspectives on the influence of social media, AI, and other forms of misinformation during this election season. Stay tuned to find out how to combat misinformation in the media.
13 of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue? Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Welcome back to Tower Talks. Tonight we have an expert panel lined up to discuss misinformation. Dr. Bethany Albertson, Associate Professor in the Government Department at UT Austin. Dr. Ehmer Arif, Assistant Professor in the School of Information and Co-Designer of Trust. Professor Kenneth Fleischman, Professor and Founding Director of Undergraduate Studies in the School of Information. Also the Founding Director of Good Systems, Ethical AI at UT Austin, and Professor Mark Strama, Professor in Moody College of Communication and Director of the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life. Welcome all of you. Thank you for coming on the panel tonight. Our first topic for tonight is defining misinformation. The topic is broad, and many find it hard to distinguish misinformations from other forms of incorrect information like disinformation. Sometimes we see exaggerations, we see rumors, gossip, these different subsets of what misinformation means. So I'm going to start with a group question for all of you guys. You all have different backgrounds in studying politics and studying the way information is communicated and understood. But the common thread among all of this is misinformation and the presence of misinformation in politics and communication. I'm curious, all of you, what led you to study misinformation in the first place? And also, how would you define misinformation in the context of your work? So maybe we can start with Bethany and go down the line.
Sure. What I care about in my research is how ordinary people think about politics. And one of the things you can't ignore in our current political context is that misinformation, disinformation, etc., is a component about how ordinary people are making sense of the political world around them, whether it's from their communities or from political elites. Now, when it comes to the precise definition of misinformation, I'm gonna take a back seat a bit. I'm gonna point out just that, right, for us it's something like falsehoods, incorrect information. We do like to distinguish in my field between mis and disinformation for the reason that there's something different about falsehoods that you believe that are put out there maybe without ill intent, and then active disinformation campaigns. The distinction there is what was the intent of the communication.
All right. Yeah, I think I came to misinformation because I study how people use technologies like social media during crisis situations to, share support, help each other, and just make sense of, in situations that are unpredictable and anxiety-provoking. And, when you study this context, you realize rumors are a natural byproduct of these kinds of circumstances, like when people are coming together to make sense of something upsetting and ambiguous, and there's not a lot of good official information, then rumors are just how people, which I treat as unverified information. It could be true, it could be false, we just don't know, right? It comes out as stories we're telling each other just to kind of restore a sense of control and understanding. So in my field, we treat rumors as natural. Right? And rumors, so I started studying that on social media back in 2014. Back then, there was a lot of rhetoric about how actually the wisdom of crowds can actually help these platforms become truth machines, where the truth will rise to the top thanks to our collective intelligence. And that has not turned out to be the case. And then my research increasingly also, it turns out when you're collecting information on these kinds of crisis situations, you will also inevitably learn about actors who are trying to exploit these situations to, intentionally spread disinformation. So yeah, that's how I got into it. And on the terminology, yeah, it's an endless regress. It's really complicated. But broadly, I understand misinformation as unintentionally false information, such as rumors, gossip. These things are not necessarily always bad. Disinformation, on the other hand, which is often affiliated with propaganda, both foreign and domestic, is, generally seen as morally problematic, right? And part of the confusion becomes like it's really hard to determine intent on the internet, right? It's impossible, really. Often the person sharing it doesn't know what their intent was. Right, the Springfield, Ohio story kind of gets at this kind of ambiguity, right, where it starts off partially as disinformation, and then as more and more people come in, there's an organic component to it. It takes on a life of its own. So yeah, it's complicated. Over to you.
Well, unlike my colleagues on this panel, I'm not a scholar. I'm a professor of practice with a background in politics. I served 5 terms in the Texas House. I got out of politics in 2013. Frankly, with the sense that this isn't a place I want to spend my time anymore, in part because the polarization of politics had made it really uncomfortable to go out in public. I mean, people feel such ill will toward their elected representatives these days if they don't share a political party with them, that it just really wasn't pleasant to walk around the neighborhood knowing that 40% of the neighborhood despised me because of a letter next to my name. And that is largely a byproduct, I think, of the way that our new information ecosystem has divided and polarized us. I think there's a lot more that kind of underlies that thesis, but in the interest of time, I would just say, I then worked 10 years at Google after I left politics. And I wasn't specifically working in the areas that are combating disinformation, though at one point I was recruited to go and work on that issue for YouTube. And so I spent a good deal of time talking to the teams there that are responsible for it. And it is a bunch of really good people trying to do good, but operating under the imperatives of a free market. And in that free market, they have obligations to shareholders, and they all are shareholders in a company that makes money by capturing people's attention and monetizing it. And it turns out that they can use machine learning to figure out what captures the most attention, and it turns out that what captures the most attention is frequently horrible content and misinformation and often disinformation. And when you tune an algorithm to optimize it for people's attention, you're going to promote and prioritize content that you shouldn't. And it's a collective action problem because no one social media company can kind of voluntarily, unilaterally disarm in the marketplace. They're just going to lose market share. And the ones that are going to win market share are the ones that tune their algorithm to optimize for attention. And in that environment, without some kind of uniform regulation, there's really I don't see a solution to that problem. So I do think that this is something that collectively as a society we're going to have to address through our very flawed and imperfect political system.
Yeah, for me, my focus is on ethics of information. So that includes ethics of AI, and that's the focus of Good Systems Ethical AI, E.T. Austin. But it also includes ethical considerations of other types of information, including initially this came from an interest in trust in scientific and medical information. And originally, that seemed to me to be somewhat separate from politics, but particularly during the pandemic. I mean, certainly we saw with debates around climate change, some degree to which those overlapped, and certainly during the pandemic, we saw a huge overlap between what was in the medical and scientific domain and what was in the political domain. My first real foray into this space was actually when former doctoral student Kalina Koltai decided to study vaccine misinformation back in 2015. So I think that was a pretty prescient choice. Kalina graduated in 2020, so it was perfect timing to be focusing on vaccine mis and disinformation, and I went on to a postdoc at University of Washington and is now at Bellingcat. And so we did a study along with another former doctoral student in Burma who's now at the Arizona State University, as well as the New York Academy of Sciences, doing a postdoc. And in this study, we were looking at the factors that influence people's trust in scientific and medical information that they see in social media. So we're fascinated by the political dimensions, considerations of people's values, what they consider important in life, and how that affected how they would view information from mainstream media versus from open access scientific journals versus from known disinformation sites. And actually, Nitin did his dissertation work on deepfakes. He also started that well before deepfakes became a big thing, so that was also a very prescient choice that he made. So it's been really, fascinating to see actually the work on COVID disinformation. We had funding from the National Science Foundation to look at how, for example, people's values as well as demographics can predict things like accuracy of knowledge about COVID-19. So we found that people who were more focused on transcending beyond themselves and looking at the larger picture, so from a universalistic, benevolent perspective, were more likely to be thoughtful about how they evaluate information, and thus had higher accuracy in terms of their understanding of COVID-19 information. But we've certainly found, as Project Warp Speed was proceeding, a lot of vaccine disinformation that had originally primarily oriented around the MMR vaccine, but very quickly moved over to COVID vaccine. And so it's quite interesting, especially among older adults, which was, of course, a population particularly susceptible to COVID-19, where there was a huge effort to vaccinate, but the threat of mis and disinformation in terms of reducing vaccination rates is a real concern.
For sharing your different perspectives on this and really getting at the nuance around misinformation. It's so hard to define. I want to come next to Emir. Your research is kind of specifically about social media and communication tools and how they disseminate misinformation. We did talk about this earlier when Mark discussed how companies kind of prioritize viewership, or they profit off of viewership. But I am curious if you can explain how exactly does social media contribute to the spread of misinformation? What are the factors there, and how should people, think about it when they're using social media?
All right. Thank you. Great question. So I'll start with the fact that, rumors, propaganda, these things have existed before the internet. Surprise, right? But I think what social media does is it's accelerated, it's increased the speed and reach by which these things can travel, right, essentially. So one way they're just contributing is they have essentially, democratized and, media, where we no longer have as many traditional gatekeepers like mainstream journalism. This comes with benefits, but it also comes with drawbacks. And so that is one factor where like anyone can talk, and you know, information can go viral in unpredictable ways. Is one factor. So like I said, like if people are doing sense making in the old days, they would just be doing it in the village or in their immediate local community, right? But now that's taking place online, and so, you know, like one accidental rumor can pick up and like just, you know, catch like wildfire. The other factor is, of course, you know, as marketing has gotten more and more sophisticated, you know, these tactics and tools are being deployed in politics and, frankly, yes, in you know, propaganda, right? So one way to concretize this is I've studied Russian disinformation campaigns targeting the 2016 elections, and over there, one of the things they've done, like these, you know, that we found was, you know, the Internet Research Agency, a known Russian troll farm, actually, you know, developed accounts, social media accounts, that targeted both Black Lives Matter activists and reactionary counter movements, right, such as Blue Lives Matter. And, you know, these accounts, they tailored their messaging to each community. For instance, by like in the Black Lives Matter community, emphasizing Hillary Clinton as a white candidate who doesn't serve the interests of African Americans, and so on, right? So it also enables this kind of micro-targeting, you know, where you can target very specific populations and issues, and wedge issues, and use them to kind of as a point of access for, you know, manipulation. So that.
I mean, I saw a presentation by former Republican Congressman Will Hurt, where he described those Russian disinformation farms as using the state of Texas and the governor of state of Texas to test the hypothesis that they could provoke a military reaction in response to disinformation. So they started an online campaign suggesting that federal military maneuvers that were happening in the state of Texas were a threat to Texas's sovereignty, and triggered the governor to call the National Guard. The whole thing was provoked by a deliberate disinformation campaign by Russian intelligence agencies, and we reacted. And that was, as Will Hurd recounted the story, that was what gave them the strategy that in 2016 to intervene in the election. Ironically, that was the election that coined the term, at least in popular parlance, fake news, to describe those disinformation campaigns coming from overseas, which then was appropriated by Donald Trump to describe everything that is ever critical of him.
Bethany or Ken, would you like to add on anything to this, to these factors around social media?
I'm thinking if there's something unique from my world that might be useful, and I'm not sure that there is, honestly, right? Except that those social media sites, you know, you do have the traditional news actors mixing with ordinary people, which creates a place where it's easy to magnify, right? If traditional news veterans, right, are also in those spaces and have appropriately more credibility, maybe, when they start retweeting or reskeeting or whatever it is today, whatever is going around, it then has more legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary people who, you know, are not equipped to navigate these things. And I guess that's where I would, we might have one level of expectation for how our political elites, expectations that are not met, by the way, but for how our political elites might be able to navigate these things. They have access to all kinds of resources, and it's in their job description, right, to see the world as it is. But ordinary people who are busy with their job, their kids, you see a story of, something that is completely made up as part of a disinformation campaign. And I like to try to give people a little room to, it's not necessarily surprising or their fault that they're falling for these campaigns.
Yeah, I would add that you can see the role of AI in this, in the 2016 campaign, in a lot of cases, you had some of these posts were not exactly perfect English. So there were some telltale signs these might not have been native speakers who were posting this content. Now with generative AI tools like ChatGPT, it's a lot easier to produce credible, authentic English. So certainly these large language model tools do make it easier to spread textual disinformation, and also with deepfakes or synthetic media, which are essentially AI-generated videos where you could make a photorealistic video of someone doing something or saying something that never actually happened in the physical world, but that looks photorealistic enough to be believable. So in that sense, we have the saying, seeing is believing. And so if you can't trust your own eyes. Of course, we've had photoshopping and various forms of visual manipulation going back to, images of the Loch Ness Monster and things like that. But certainly it's incredibly sophisticated when you can have people posing as specific political figures, and it makes it much harder for the everyday user who's encountering content online to discern what is authentic content and what is this synthetic AI-generated content.
Can I also add something to that? Because she said it is the responsibility of our political leaders to actually separate fact from fiction and to know reality. But let's be honest, I think J.D. Vance believed that he was speaking a truth when he said they're eating dogs in Springfield.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, I don't think Donald Trump gave it any thought whether it was true, but I think J.D. Vance believed it was true. He had consumed it in the barrage of information that comes to us through our phones. He had seen it. It was being amplified by voices he trusts. He's in an information bubble no less than any of the rest of us, and probably gave it very little thought. Of course it's true. Somebody is amplifying something that somebody thinks is true on the internet. And and by the way, the original person who posted that information, who now says, I didn't have any verification that it was true, I was 3 degrees removed from this actual source, wasn't trying to create disinformation, it was misinformation. And so he absorbed it, he spouts it in the public domain, and then Donald Trump spouts it in a debate. And, a lot of right-wing commentators were apoplectic that the right-wing information ecosystem had misinformed their candidate for president in a way that cost him that debate and that created terrible headlines for him for a week after that debate. That's how complicated the information ecosystem is. Yes, they should hold themselves to a higher standard, but they're just people. And they're scrolling the same phone we are.
He is. He's also a senator with access to Congressional Research Service, right, who presumably has some awareness of the racial tropes that was trafficked in, right? Which is, yes, he's an ordinary person seeing a report that he thought was legitimate. We do want our leaders to take a second with information that might be particularly inflammatory and do some basic due diligence on it. But yeah.
I don't disagree with that. But it is just fascinating. I mean, it was not an innocent mistake because it was an irresponsible mistake, but it wasn't a deliberate lie, I don't think.
Okay, on that note, how do you feel then about the responsibility that politicians or these kind of authorities, the people on screen have to be telling the truth? Or is it okay for them to share misinformation? Is that just fair game to them?
I doubt any of us are going to argue that it's okay to be wrong, but people are going to be wrong sometimes. And, you know, like the standard should be high, exactly. And people in public office who have big microphones should hold themselves to a high standard. As the discourse online has coarsened and weakened, so has the discourse in the political domain. It reflects, you know, unfortunately, our political representation is something of a funhouse mirror of ourselves. And, you know, there's a reason that those algorithms optimize bad content. We tend to click on it. That's how that kind of content gets prioritized in the algorithm. That's kind of on us, too.
Ken, I want to turn to you now. With your research regarding ethics in artificial intelligence, AI, you did talk earlier about how AI is spreading misinformation. Can you tell us a little bit about how AI can be used to ethically and effectively combat misinformation?
Absolutely. So this is an ongoing research topic within Good Systems Ethical AI ET Austin. So one of our core research projects, which is co-led by Matt Leese, a professor in the School of Information, and D. Raj Murthy, a professor in the Moody College of Communication, is focusing on information integrity. They're actually also researchers from McCombs, from COLA, from CNS. It's like, you know, all of Good Systems, very much a campus-wide initiative. And they're doing some really exciting research about how AI can assist fact checkers. Fact checkers have a really hard job to be able to, in real time, deal with all the information that's coming in, where some of these things may be hard if you're not actually on the ground in a certain location to be able to ascertain, you know, what is actually accurate or inaccurate information. So being able to come up with AI-based tools to assist these fact checkers is really important.
And then I want to turn to you, Mark, now. You did speak at length about this earlier, about the polarization that we see and how you've seen it in politics in your work. But can you kind of explain how misinformation has contributed to this culture of polarization and skepticism, and maybe how it's evolved from, you know, earlier in your career to now, where you have like received criticisms for it or around it?
Yeah, I talked about polarization, so let's talk about skepticism. You know, I show a picture at the beginning of a class I teach of Lyndon Johnson sitting in the Oval Office watching 3 TV screens. And by watching those 3 network news broadcasts every night, he knew the facts as the American public understood them. And in fact, he didn't even have to watch 3 because there was almost no variation from one to the next. There was essentially a common truth. It wasn't always accurate. It was an environment in which it wasn't hard to deceive people, to be honest, because you just had to deceive one news conveyor and you won the day. We now have an infinite number of sources of information and no shared reality at all. And that has led a vast number of voters to just throw up their hands and say, we'll never know, about things that are actually knowable. And they just don't trust any information source. It's why the polls barely move after what should be monumental shifts in the dynamic of the race. Joe Biden faceplants in the first debate. The polls barely moved. Donald Trump faceplants in the second debate. The polls barely move. And it is because people have just suspended disbelief and have felt that they could just create their own version of reality based on whatever information source they choose that validates their priors. So that's, I think, you know, the journalism industry really struggles with how do we tell truth to people in a way that they will receive it. And I think they try really hard. They get a lot of criticism from people who say they're not meeting the moment. What are they supposed to do? They call lies lies frequently, in my opinion. But if you don't want to believe it's a lie, how can they make, there was a state senator when I served in the legislature from East Texas who in the middle of an argument on the Senate floor said, "Senator, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you." And that is, I feel like, the problem that the media is confronting today.
And I want to turn to you now, Bethany, for our last question in section 1 of this panel. Your background is in political psychology. Would you be able to explain a little bit about what that means, what that field is, and also explain how, from a psychological perspective, understanding the psychology, how does the public respond to misinformation that's targeting their pathos?
Okay, so political psychology is applying insights from psychology to understanding political opinion, political behavior, right? So part of my training was in political science and part of my training was in social psychology. We tend to do, not always, but we tend to do experimental work in which we manipulate perhaps a message, a campaign advertisement in which we tweak the music, tweak the whatever we're trying to. Some of my experiments are about changing an emotional reaction. Some of my experiments, I did a few in the realm of misinformation, but it's not squarely my research area. What people in this area try to do is see, why do people hold in misinformation? And there's a lot of energy around how do you get people to correct, or can you correct misinformation? Why do you hold misinformation? You've been exposed to it. It's consistent with your values. It supports an identity that's important to you, right? Those are some key reasons why people hold it, and they don't recognize it as such, right? How do you correct it? That's really, really hard. There's been a ton of energy around this, and the dominant takeaway that I teach in my graduate seminar, where we do a week on this, not as much as some other people here, is that you can correct it sometimes for a little bit, right? And it doesn't hold. So if you do a single shot experiment, particularly with a messenger who is on the other side, right? So some of the Obamacare misinformation experiments found that a Republican who was invested in the legislation, doing messaging against the misinformation around what they called death panels, that could move, I'm referring to Adam Brodsky's work here, that could move opinion, but then a couple weeks later it was gone. Right? So I think the larger insight from the people who do my kind of work is that stopping it as it's getting out is really important, because once people have it, it's hard to dislodge it.
Well, thank you for that answer, and I'm glad that we're talking about how people can like some of the solutions to how people can address misinformation, because we're going to be getting into that in the next section of our panel. So stay tuned.
(13) of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue? Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered. Comprised of a studious reporting staff going lengths to get that scoop, and a talented technical team to enhance your screen visually. As a fellow Longhorn, your mornings are better with us. So start your day the Vivo way. Good Morning Longhorns, Wednesdays at 7 a.m. Central Time on TSTV.
Of the 48 club sports offered by the university now require students to submit proof of sex assigned at birth.
I know deep down they would probably want to stay with the university.
No way in hell anybody's going to tell my daughters what to do with their bodies.
This state is one of the worst in child education.
We can't take it anymore, seeing those scenes.
Going to Hillel on Friday night, all my family members kept texting me not to go.
There's a huge housing crisis in Austin. Do you have a plan in place to address this issue?
Welcome back to Tower Talks. We'll be moving on to our final topic of discussion, the future of misinformation. So we're looking at solutions, what people can do about misinformation. And I want to start with one question for the whole panel, all of you can answer. What role should governments and regulatory bodies play in combating misinformation? I would like to start.
I can start from take a different spin on this. To me, governments need to kind of actually stay a little bit away from regulating these areas because right now the area has gotten really politicized, actually. So, the word misinformation, for instance, so researchers and journalists who work in this area are getting targeted and harassed extensively. And some of that harassment is coming in the form of pressure from, people in public office, to be honest. So if I think the most important thing is protecting research and the freedom to do research and work in this area because it's being attacked as censorship. And I think that's something we need to work out politically and collectively before we try to develop more robust regulation in this area.
When you were saying that, it occurred to me that there's misinformation about the study of misinformation, and that's a problem, right? It is not a politically motivated study to target politicians. People who study misinformation will point out that people on all sides of the political spectrum, right, believe misinformation. Some of it with, more dire political consequences, I would add, and differences among elites, but right, no party, no ideology has, everyone, it's one of my favorite sayings, everyone believes a few crazy things, a few people believe a lot of crazy things, and that's, if you look at the mass public, that's kind of the story.
I think maybe there's a path to get at this by taking it out of politics, because the politicization of this issue has been terrible for it. But there's misinformation on healthcare. There's misinformation about stock investing. A lot of people lost a lot of money gambling on GameStop when it was just completely out of control, and that was all because of misinformation online and some deliberate disinformation. So I said earlier, this is a collective action problem. That you can't count on the companies to regulate themselves because they will lose market share by doing so, and you won't have solved the problem. So I do think at some point there has to be government intervention, there has to be regulation, or they could self-regulate collectively if they can solve that collective action problem barrier. I also, though I think it ultimately is something that has to be done collectively, and usually we do things collectively through government intervention, I don't think it's about to happen anytime soon. And the reason is something you said. If you poll Americans and ask them, should the government do something to regulate the internet, almost 100% of them will say yes. The problem is 50% of them mean we should protect free speech on the internet and not let the platforms censor anybody, and half of them mean we should make the platform censor a lot more things. And because they have completely diametrically opposed views of what the regulation should look like, and because it's an incredibly complicated and technical topic that the members of Congress are ill-equipped to deal with, you're not going to see any action on it anytime soon. So the best thing people can do in the meantime is become media literate and literate about the information that they're consuming.
And I think in turn, government can invest in education efforts to improve people's information literacy, to try to, and this is important for K through 12 as well as higher ed, also important for continuing education and to make sure that everyone, public outreach, informal education through museums and libraries. I know, Emma, you're doing some really excellent work with libraries.
Yeah, it's like a segue. We were talking about media literacy. And for me, there is cause for hope. Like there is more interest and energy being placed in helping us kind of become, all of us becoming better partners in this collective conversation that we need to be having. So like one of the cool things we're doing at the iSchool is we're doing this project called Co-Designing for Trust, which is this massive, NSF-funded effort where we're working with marginalized communities, particularly rural and BIPOC communities, to kind of, develop that media literacy. We work with librarians, high school teachers, and community organizers like, people in church and senior citizen groups. And we're working with them to kind of educate them about misinformation, and talk about all of these issues so that they can be better partners in this kind of larger conversation we all need to be having. Stuff's happening.
I do have maybe one positive way to look at this problem. Because it's a big problem and mostly my views on it are negative. But I do temper my views with this. Our phones were born about the same time today's generation of undergraduates were born. Actually, a little bit after. They're younger than y'all are. And y'all, assuming you're an undergraduate,
yes,
y'all are really smart. You're not fully formed yet either. Like, you'll get smarter. That's why you're here. And the same is true for these things. I mean, they're in their very early stage. They are the Wild West. They're completely uncivilized. In the early days of the internet, there was a famous New Yorker cartoon. This was in like 1993, with a picture of a dog sitting at a computer, and he turns to the dog next to him and he says, the great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog. And the anonymity afforded by the internet has brought out the absolute worst in a lot of people and has contributed to this climate of hate and disinformation and misinformation. And we have not yet imposed on the internet, whether we end up doing it through government or just through civility, through civilization, we have not civilized the internet. It is the Wild West. And in the Wild West, in early undeveloped civilizations, there is violence, there is lies, there is no accountability, there are no social norms, and eventually people learn to live together. Nobody behaves in real life. Very few people behave in real life the way they behave on the internet. And at some point, the internet will be good enough for us to act toward each other the way we act in real life. And when it is, I think it's a tool for a lot of great things. That's my hope for it. I don't know how soon we'll get there, but I do think we'll get there.
Okay, hopefully soon. And I appreciate this hopeful note to all of this misinformation. I do have one final question for all of you before we close out the panel tonight. I just want to know your lasting thoughts, your takeaways regarding misinformation and the role it's playing in this 2024 presidential election season. What do you want people to realize about misinformation going forward and going to November? Maybe we can start with you and come down.
Yeah, I'd say that it's really important that people are critical information consumers, and that we broaden our information appetites. So there's been a lot of discussions of echo chambers and the degree to which people get sort of stuck in their own little filter bubbles and aren't, exposed to that wide fire hose of information that's coming at them. There's certainly a lot of information, but I think that relying only on one particular form of media or media channel might be a bit limiting. So it's good to diversify your media diet to some degree. At the same time, it's really, again, important to be a conscientious, thoughtful consumer. So think about the individuals that are providing that information, any agendas they might have, any biases they might have, and factor that into your thought-making process.
The same. I mean, I think we should all hold ourselves to the standard that Bethany described earlier in the conversation. We all actually have access to the Congressional Research Service now. It's all published on the internet. The truth is there. You have to be a critical consumer of information to find it.
Oh boy, I've got a laundry list. But seriously, I think at least one or 2 points that I do want people to realize. I think first it is, don't let this, the threat of mis and disinformation dissuade you from engaging in dialogue around this stuff on the internet, right? A big part of the motivation behind these disinformation campaigns is just to kill the possibility of discourse. And if you're already engaging in a lot of doubt, am I talking to a Russian bot? Chances are you're not, right? Do have some faith. So one, I would say, don't let it, stop you from just pursuing information and engaging in the political process, right, is one. And two, building on being a critical consumer. I think one theme that's coming out of today's conversation was around kind of information overload, speed, how fast this stuff happens and moves, right? And so what I want people to realize is part of being a critical consumer of information today is to sometimes slow down and be mindful, right? It's we are just, as you said, in the arc of history, we're just learning to adapt to this kind of speed, right? And so it can be useful to just have the practice of just if you're reading something that's making you mad, or reading something that's just pause before you hit that, reshare button, right? Just think, even give it a couple of moments, because that can help your emotional and your conscious reasoning catch up a little bit, because that's how they often get you. They don't get you here, they get you here, and you need time for the brain to catch up.
I think what I'd add to that is to say, I think checking on what you're doing yourself in terms of consuming information is important. It's likely that people in your life are spreading misinformation, and that you see them do it, because most of us do at some point, right? And I think that we have a responsibility to let our friends and family know when they're doing that, that that's what's happening. Now, right, there's ways to do it in a friendly, suggestive way. I have a friend on social media who will always just, if you happen to pass on something that turns out to be wrong, will say, friends don't let friends retweet this, right? And, right, yeah, you're right, thank you. Because I don't want to be the person who does that. And I'm putting my friendly suggestion, I think, in a pretty scary context right now, because I think it should be, right? Our elections are secure. And we have people pushing misinformation about that, right? And the consequences for that are really, really dire. And so
I think the other thing to think about when you think about misinformation is that it's not all equal in terms of the political or health or social consequences that misinformation can have, right? Vaccine skepticism, denial, etc., can have terrible consequences for public health. Election misinformation can have terrible consequences for a democracy. And so I want to couple my friendly suggestion about stopping mis and disinformation when you see it with the reminder that the stakes are really high.
Well, thank you all for being on the panel tonight. This was a fascinating conversation about misinformation and its effect on the election. Tune in next week to hear about the Supreme Court. Be sure to follow us on social media at TSTV News on X, formerly Twitter, and at towertalks TSTV on Instagram. From all of us here in the studio, thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.
Determined to start your day well? We're up bright and early. From the enriching local stories to the weather forecast later in the day. Rain or shine, at Good Morning Longhorns, we got you covered.